All right, folks, we're here today to learn how to write the fourth type of FRQ, the concept application. I sometimes refer to it as the content application because in this type of FRQ, this is where your IDs are going to come in real handy. Okay, having all those IDs on all that different terminology, this is what it's for. Okay, the concept application FRQ. So what will you be asked to do? In general, you're going to be asked to describe, explain, compare political principles, and yes, we mean those constitutional principles, such as federalism, checks and balances, separation of powers, republicanism, institutions such as Congress, the presidency, the judicial branch, the bureaucracy, processes like the bill to law process, policies, certain particular laws, and political behaviors. So you think ideology. Okay. In general, you'll be asked to describe, explain how political principles, institutions, processes, policies, and behaviors are illustrated and or applied to different scenarios in a context. Okay, what you will not be asked to do but are expected to do, make sure you define the term in part A. So the prompt for A might ask you about a particular institution or a process. You need to define it, describe that term, or you will not get the point. Use an example, even if hypothetical, for every time it asks you to explain something. Throw in an example. It helps clarify your reasoning. And then think basics. Okay, what are the institution's essential powers? Congress makes laws, the presidency enforces laws, the Supreme Court interprets the laws. Yes, you will have to go behind that or beyond that, but knowing the basics is always going to get you a correct answer also. And what are the checks on its powers? So if it's asking about Congress, know what powers the presidency and the Supreme Court have over Congress. Knowing your checks and balances, having that memorized, helps you with this particular FRQ a lot. Okay, so the scoring, it's going to be 3 to 4 points. More likely that it'll be 3 points. But remember, even though it's less points than the argument essay, it is worth the same as the argument essay. So to get the point in A, you're going to be asked to describe a political institution, behavior, or process. Okay, so that's really just providing a definition to a particular term. In B, you'll be asked to do and explain. So make sure that you work in that example. Okay, so explain how the response in part A, whatever you chose, affects a political process, government entity, or citizen behavior. And finally, in C, you're going to ask to explain how the scenario relates to an institution, behavior, or process. It seems like the same thing, right? So let's look at a particular example here. So this here says the following is from the 2016 Republican Party platform. Because the Federal Reserve's monetary policy decisions affect job creation, upward mobility for workers, and equitable prosperity, they should be transparent. Similarly, the Federal Reserve's important role as a lender of last resort should also be carried out in a more transparent manner. The Republican Party will advance legislation that brings transparency and accountability to the Federal Reserve, the Federal Open Market Committee, and the Federal Reserve's dealings with foreign banks. Okay, now a couple things here. We have not yet studied the Federal Reserve. It's part of the federal bureaucracy, which is part of the executive branch. Okay, so you would know certain things about that. So in A here, it says describe an action other than advancing legislation that members of Congress may take to bring transparency and accountability to the Federal Reserve. In B, it says in the context of the scenario of the section of the Republican Party platform, explain how the proposal to increase transparency and accountability described in Part A would affect the Federal Reserve's ability to make economic policy. And then for C, explain how ideological difference between the parties might affect Democratic Party support of the proposal. You'll note there's a lot of big words. It's fancy language. It's AP language. Let's break those down step by step here. So in A, okay, describe an action other than advancing legislation, so other than making laws that members of Congress may take to bring transparency and accountability to the Federal Reserve. That's your context. So you have to ask yourself, what else does Congress do besides lawmaking? Now, we're in that unit right now. Eventually, you're going to find that a big thing that Congress do is provide oversight. So they basically make sure that the executive branch is executing, enforcing the laws as they intended. Okay, so they can conduct investigations through their oversight power. Make sure that you define that term. So if I selected oversight as something that Congress could do, I better define oversight and explain and describe what it is. Okay? And I'm going to use it in that context. I'm going to make sure that I use a phrase like, in order to bring transparency and accountability to the Federal Reserve. Again, when you repeat the language of the prompt, you're using the context of the scenario. And you can lose a point if you don't use the context of the scenario. I can't stress that enough. Okay, but A should be an easy point, and it's kind of open-ended. All you have to do is demonstrate you know what Congress does besides make laws. Okay, B, in the context of the scenario of this section of the Republican Party platform, explain how the proposal to increase transparency and accountability desired in Part A would affect the Federal Reserve's ability to make economic policy. Okay, so again, it's very wordy, but it's basically asking you what would be the impact on the Federal Reserve's ability to make economic policy. So ask yourself, what does the Fed do? It's the short way to say Federal Reserve. Okay, how does the Fed exercise power? There's a couple of different ways. One thing that the Fed primarily does is raise and lower interest rates. Okay, and that's how it controls the economy. So what impact does oversight then have on the Fed's power to raise and lower interest rates if I was going to go with that particular thing? So I have to demonstrate I understand something the Fed has power over, some kind of power they exercise, right? And then I have to link that to what I stated in A. And in this case, it's congressional oversight. How can congressional oversight affect that power? And I have to remember to use the context of the scenario. So it's still all about, increasing transparency and accountability over the Federal Reserve System. Finally, I get down to C, explain the ideological difference between the parties, how that might affect Democratic support of the proposal, right? So I got to keep it simple here. What are they hinting at? What are they suggesting? They basically want me to demonstrate that I understand in general how Republicans feel about government's role in the economy versus how Democrats feel about the government's role in the economy. Okay, but then again, I have to link it to the context of the scenario. Okay, and that's what you do. It's pretty straightforward. This is not the best example because we haven't really studied some of this stuff, but keep it simple. All right, and you'll do just fine. Now, if I were you, I'd go right on to the Jennifer Hitchcock video and watch that. She's smarter than I am, and she's been doing this longer than I have, and she probably has a more student-centered approach to explaining the concept application FRQ. All right, we will see you.